So, hello, welcome back after the coffee break. I suppose those coffee breaks are as important as the consultations because it's a very good opportunity to meet the old friends, to get new contacts, and probably to start some common new projects. My name is Donatas Puslys. I'm the head of the Vilnius Institute of Policy Analysis of its media analysis program, and our session today is called Vulnerable Data and Vulnerable Citizens. This consultation, the second one, is quite comfortably located in between the two consultations. In the first one, you heard more about Russia. In the third one, you will hear more about China. And speaking about data protection or disinformation, we have challenges from both of these countries. And I suppose that we know more about Russia, but we know less about China and its strategic interests. It would be easy to start this session with speaking about the disinformation, but I think every one of us understand the challenges of disinformation. At least the statistics from the European Commission, for example, shows that 80% of Europeans have come across information they believe was false or misleading several times a month or more. 85% of respondents perceive this as a problem in their country, and 83% of Europeans consider fake news to present a problem for democracy in general. So this is quite obvious. But then you may ask, what's not that obvious? Where are the problems? Why should we still discuss the things that were discussed many, many times? And at least in my opinion, I think we have several challenges. We still have to speak about the media literacy, for example. And it's not only about the new technologies and how we use them, it's also about, for example, understanding how much data we voluntarily deliver to some sources that later come back to us with some projects or targeted campaigns. We had several occasions, for example, with Yandex or face apps on Facebook and so on. But we have to speak about this because sometimes we give too much information about ourselves. We have to speak about regulation, and regulation in two different ways. We know that the traditional media is quite strictly regulated. We have ethics commissions and so on. We have rules that state, for example, that if you breach the journalistic ethics, you are not allowed to get the state sponsorship and so on. What about the new media and the regulations in there? And also, we can speak about the local regulations, but are those regulations enough? What we can do in the European level, because all those social networks and big platform search engines, they operate on a global level, and probably local regulations are not enough. So there are a lot of so-called gray zones, which poses a question to us: what to do, how to better protect our data, which kind of regulations are needed. And for those questions to be discussed, today we have 4 panelists, so let me present them. We have Frederik Zuiderveen Borgesius. He's a professor at the Radboud University in Nijmegen in the Netherlands. Welcome. We have Rolf Fredheim, who is the principal scientist at NATO StratCom Center of Excellence in Riga, in Latvia. And we have Nicolás de Pedro, who is the senior fellow of the Institute for Statecraft in the United Kingdom. And we have Natalija Bitiukova, who is the data protection lawyer and also a board member of Civil Liberties Union for Europe. And first of all, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Frederik Borgesius, who will open the panel with his insight on political behavioral advertising and the challenges it brings to the healthy functioning of our political systems. So.
What are we now, morning or afternoon? Afternoon, I think. Good afternoon, everybody. Indeed, my name is Frederik. And I'll briefly say something about online political micro-targeting. I don't see a clock here, so moderator. Yeah. Could you forward one slide? Oh, I got it. It's not, oops, it keeps on moving spontaneously. I'll do it without moving slides otherwise. Okay. One back? Yeah, not everything I tell now, it's partly based on a group effort with a big team, also political scientists and communication scholars rewrote a paper on online political micro-targeting. And I'll briefly explain what it is. Next slide, please. Perhaps it has happened to you that you've looked at a hotel on the internet, or that you've looked at a certain flight. You want to fly to London, for instance, and, or at a pair of new running shoes, and everywhere on the internet you are followed around by that same advertisement. Has that happened to you? Yeah. That is called behavioral advertising. Next slide, please. The same technology can be used for political advertising. So, for instance, I'm simplifying, but a political party can work with a marketing company. If the marketing company sees that you visit many websites about the environment, then a political party can target you with ads only explaining what that party will do for the environment. If you visit many websites about if you visit many websites that say that there's a problem with immigration, then a right-leaning party could target you with ads emphasizing or even exaggerating the supposed problem of immigration, for instance. Next slide, please. So that is political micro-targeting, and it brings several opportunities and threats, and you can roughly categorize them into, let's first focus on the threats on the right side. You can roughly categorize them as threats for citizens, for us, threats for political parties, and threats for public opinion, and together these form threats for our democracy as a whole. And I want to emphasize this is not only if evil secret services from other countries engage in political micro-targeting. Many of these threats also play a role if only civilized parties use online political micro-targeting. So let's first focus on citizens. This type of targeted advertising gives political parties and marketing companies an incentive to collect as much data as possible because, well, you know the business model of Facebook and Google. Many marketing companies for the political sphere have a similar business model. So that gives them more incentive to collect more data about citizens. So there's a privacy issue. There's also a risk of manipulation. You can imagine that, in theory at least, with enough data, political advertisers can play on your deepest fears and advertise based on that. There's such an information asymmetry between the citizens and this marketing machinery with hundreds of psychologists and computer scientists working at Facebook, for instance. So people might be manipulated. And depending on the national constitution, on how the voting is organized, in England and UK, for instance, no, in the UK and in the US, certain regions, when you win that region, it all goes to one party. So for instance, if you have a certain state in the US, if the Republicans win it, that counts as one state for the Republicans. Imagine there's a state where everybody expects the Republicans to win anyway. Then the Republicans might not invest in any advertising, their political advertising, because they don't have to convince their usual voters anymore. The Democrats might think it's not worth investing money, so then you might have a region where people are less informed about political campaigns, because parties don't even invest in political ads anymore there. So people could be excluded. Then we look at threats for political parties. At the start, when most parties do not engage in such internet-based political advertising yet, then it could be a cheap way for a smaller party that can't afford big campaigns on television, etc. It could be a cheap way to focus or to reach, for instance, student voters on a certain topic, or to reach certain voters who care a lot about, I don't know, a bridge being built or about the environment. However, if all the parties have joined, then if all the parties start using such internet-based micro-targeting, then richer parties have a clear advantage, especially because they can hire better consultants, buy more databases, etc. So at the start, there's a first mover advantage. When all the parties have joined, then there's a clear advantage for the richest parties. And a second threat for political parties is because there are intermediaries like Facebook. These intermediaries, these companies, have much power. Facebook basically lets through any advertisers, but there's, for instance, in Holland we have many parties, sometimes 12 or 15, and there's one consultancy, a marketing company for political parties, for instance, and they say, we will not provide our services to extreme right parties. And you can have some sympathy for that policy of that company. On the other hand, it also shows how powerful these companies are suddenly have become, because they can basically make certain types of advertising impossible for parties. Imagine that Facebook would choose parties and would say certain parties we are not helping at all anymore, then a certain channel is cut off for certain political parties. And then we move to the right, to the bottom, threats for public opinion. Imagine you're a student and you get ads of political parties where they all explain we're going to aim for instance, for lower pricing for university costs, and other parties might also have messages that are especially important for students. For instance, we're going to lower the value-added tax on books or something. If you all get these targeted and personalized ads, then you may not know, then voters may not know what the real priorities are of a party, because for each voter the party only explains what the party will do on that particular topic. And the second point is, in, let's say, 20 years ago, when all campaigns were done with posters on television and in newspapers, then it were usually a couple of big themes, perhaps national security, are there enough jobs, economy, that dominated the whole debate. So it was pretty clear what the main debates were, and a disadvantage was that you wouldn't know about more detailed topics. Many voters won't know exactly what the party is planning to do on that point. So an advantage of micro-targeting is that more niche topics also get attention in the campaigns. A disadvantage is if this micro-targeting develops further, then people may lose track of the bigger debates and may only know, let's say students may only know if they don't watch television and don't read much newspapers, etc. They may only know what all these parties think, for instance, about university costs, the costs of studying. As a scientist, we also pointed out in the paper that there are also some opportunities, promises. For instance, with smartly targeted ads, you can interest people in politics, also people like many young people that don't watch television and don't read newspapers. It is also an advantage that people can learn more about niche topics. For instance, if 3 big themes dominate the campaigns on television and the discussions on television, then micro-targeted ads may enable parties with more, or may enable parties to inform voters on smaller topics. So there are promises and threats. But that is mostly me as a scientist speaking. I have to admit that as a citizen, as a newspaper reader, I'm mostly really scared of this. So personally, I mostly see the threats, but as a scientist, we did our best to paint a neutral picture and to give both pros and contras. Yeah, that was my main message. Oh, I can add something. Namely that if policymakers would consider doing something, I think a good first step would be rules that require more transparency. You could, for instance, require that each political party that uses personalized ads also puts a copy of that personalized ad on a centralized website, like that, because I won't see what my neighbor gets for ads, but then journalists and researchers could still, in one place, see what parties promise to different people. But more aggressive policymakers have more possibilities. For instance, there's various European countries, there are not many rules yet on political microtargeting, but there are various European countries who prohibit, for instance, political advertising on television. Reasoning is roughly because if you would allow that, then richer parties would have an unfair advantage because they can buy more television ads. It illustrates at least that there are many policy options and that in principle you can also prohibit certain types of advertising. And the European Court of Human Rights has said that if there's a good policy decision behind it, then even though political parties have a very strong freedom of expression claim, and rightly so, if there's a good debate and good reasoning behind a ban for certain types of political ads, it would probably survive scrutiny of the Human Rights Court. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Frederik, for interesting insights and actually quite impressive recommendations. Now I would like to continue our panel and invite Nicolás de Pedro to share his ideas, especially about Kremlin's tactics that it uses to intimidate its opponents and also to influence our democratic processes. And this goes quite a lot about cyber attacks too. So, Nicolás, the floor is yours.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. First of all, I want to thank VIPA for having me. Sorry, 1 second, I will put the clock. Sorry. Yeah. So I was saying that thank you very much to VIPA for having me here. I'm very pleased, I'm delighted to be here. It's always a pleasure to be in Vilnius. And I'm very delighted because it's the second time that I'm taking part in these VIPA consultations, and it's always good to be invited to a place for a second time because it means that the first one probably was not that bad. And I'm also happy because or particularly happy this year because of this big Spanish involvement. It's very encouraging, coming from Spain, which is not always the case that in Spain, issues related to Russia or hybrid threats are top on the agenda sometimes. Yeah? So I'm very happy, and I'm very grateful also to the Spanish embassy and particularly to Spanish Ambassador Robles Fraga for his personal support and involvement with this conference. well, I have been requested to talk or to reflect a little bit about these cyber attacks, and it's funny because I can start with, it sounds like a joke, but the point in my case is that I have been twice a victim of this kind of attacks. So I'm not sure if that means that I'm an expert, but definitely I have a story to share as a victim of these attacks. And well, maybe some of you are familiar with these, the attacks that my institute suffered a year ago, more or less, with one of our programs, the Integrity Initiative. There is plenty of very sensational information online that really does not reflect the nature and the reality of the program, but it's very, I mean, extensive coverage on the Russian or the Kremlin media and all that. I also suffered a similar incident in 2016 related to these DC leaks in the context of the US elections, because for a year I was working, or more or less for a year I was working as a consultant for the Open Society Foundation. And then because they did not only hack the servers of the Democratic Party, but also the servers of the Open Society, and they found, well, actually nothing, basically a contract and in terms of reference for a project, but they're very good at twisting things, yeah, and transforming nothing into something that sounds quite sensational and dangerous and huge. And well, when you face this kind of incident, yeah, it has an impact on you, definitely, because all of a sudden it's like a storm, it's like a tsunami, particularly on social media, and then you are receiving very negative inputs, yeah? And all of a sudden someone publishes a tweet saying that, oh, this guy is this and this and that, yeah? And you can imagine, a piece of shit, blah, 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 things like that, yeah? And then it has like, I remember once, there was a tweet saying something like this about me, and then there was like, I don't remember, but something like 500 retweets in 15 minutes or something like that. And believe me, this has an impact, yeah? Your phone is like, bubble, 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 like this, and you're saying, oh, wow, you think, oh, everyone agrees. I'm a bastard, yeah, or I have done this and that. Then you realize that this is automated, yeah, this is artificial, but it definitely has an impact. And the impact is not only it's not only targeting the direct victim, but it's also a message for those that maybe will consider at some point to work with you. So it's trying to make it difficult for those of us who deal particularly with Russian efforts and Russian stuff. I'm sorry, and definitely this is about the Kremlin, not about Russian citizens or not about Russian people. It's not about Russophobia, blah, blah, blah. It's about the Kremlin, yeah? And, well, it has an impact, more limited. Up to now, I would say that the impact is much more limited than what it could be, but I think the worst is yet to come. In terms of cybersecurity, well, I'm not an expert, but definitely there is an issue. I mean, I'm not a technical expert on the technical side, but definitely there is an issue if our communications are not secure, yeah? And this is accepted by many as, well, you know, and many people, when I have faced, or my institute and my team has faced this problem, many people have talked to us and said, well, you know, these things happen, yeah? Well, I don't know. But I'm sure that it's not the same when it happens to you than when it happens to others. And I don't know, I never hacked the email of anyone. I have never stole any information from anyone's computer or things like that. I never did that, yeah? So I'm not sure that we are all using the same kind of rules for this game, yeah? So different context applies. And so there are issues, yeah, related to securing communications, and this is definitely number one. It's also about the artificial manipulation of conversation flows on social media. This is something that can be done, that has nothing to do with censorship, Ministry of Truth, or blah, 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 but it's simply to have an organic, natural conversation on this kind of social media. So I'm sure that something can be done in this regard, but still, it's going to be particularly difficult, and I think that the challenge that we have ahead is quite serious. a year ago, I remember, I think the main key takeaway from this event was, well, let's stop from admiring the problem and let's move to tackle the problem, yeah? Let's do something. And yes, definitely, I fully agree with that, but I'm not that convinced that we have a full understanding of the problem, yeah, that we are facing. That's why I think it's badly required to gather people and to have units, yeah, with a high level of expertise, combining expertise from different fields. Because as it has been clear from the speech by Mr. Grinda and in the previous panel and by the previous speaker, this is very wide and has implications on several domains. For instance, our institute, we have faced also problems with lawyers that appear all of a sudden. We don't know who hired them, but all of a sudden they are so concerned with this and they are making our lives difficult. Yeah? So it has very different dimensions. And what is at stake is finally to have, is the integrity or the healthy of the liberal democratic system. And in the long run, we can think that we have advantages. I think so, yeah? Democratic systems, in the long run, have advantages. But in the short term, well, we are facing difficulties, yeah? Compared to authoritarian regimes. More effective, like Chinese, less effective, like Russia. A typical mistake or misunderstanding in Western Europe particularly is about Russia, yeah? To think, oh, come on. But Russia, you know, the GDP is the size of Italy or Spain. It's full of problems, blah, blah, blah. Yes, true, that's absolutely correct. But they are not trying to build something. They are trying, and I insist, I'm referring to the Kremlin. They're trying to undermine us, and that's completely different. Yeah? It's a big difference between trying to create or build up something and to destroy something. It's much easier, yeah? And you can be much more effective, and the goal is about destroying us. Related to the data protection and social media and all that, yes, as Marius has said, yeah, education is a key thing. Yeah? I think there is a wrong approach when we talk about fake news or disinformation, and there are many recommendations to the general audience. Please check information twice, make sure that what you are retweeting or whatever is accurate and blah, blah, blah. That's not going to happen. So we cannot ask the average citizen to be fact checkers. Yeah? Fact checkers are or should be journalists, yeah, or people producing information, but not average citizens, because that's not going to happen, because no one is going to check twice whether someone really said this or this video is really from this location or whatever or that. The education, in my opinion, should be more oriented towards the very idea of what we are doing in terms of giving all of our information with our smartphones and everything, yeah, to basically to Google, Facebook, and a few other companies that have all of our information. There is no precedent in history, I think, of this concentration of information in just few hands that will decide. I mean, they know, they monitor all our moves, with whom we talk, at what time, where we are, if we are sleeping, if we're awake, if we are walking, if we're just standby or whatever. But also, they have the technical capacity to decide which information we are going to have, we are going to get access to. That's a huge problem, yeah? Because we are very concerned about having a public ministry of truth, but we seem very much less concerned about having a private ministry of truth, yeah? That can be particularly problematic. And of course, this is very challenging because social media is fun, yeah? People are basically having fun in social media and happily sharing everything. And then we have a situation that would be the dream of the Stasi, yeah, in East Germany, yeah, of people just sharing everything, having cameras and microphones at home, and the phone recording all our conversations at home, yeah. Yeah, in principle, just to provide ads, yeah, commercial ads. Well, yes, but are we sure about that? And the second, so this is the first problem, yeah. So we need to educate everyone, yeah? And I think maybe I sound like old grand guy, very upset and concerned, beware, be concerned, the end is near. Maybe, I don't know, it's not my intention. But we are going to have, for the first time, a generation whose life is completely on social media. I'm very happy that I did not use Facebook or Twitter till I was 30 or 30-something. So my 20s and before, it's in the real deep, dark web, yeah? Look, with nothing the Kremlin created super huge stories twisting, yeah, about my professional life. Imagine if they have my records of partying when I was 19 or 20, yeah, of tweeting whatever stupid thing, yeah? And we are going to have a new generation of that, yeah? That's going to be a huge challenge. The second one, and related to this, yeah? So this is something that that appeals to the whole society, and it's a quite difficult and challenging situation that needs the participation of the whole society at different levels. But the second dimensional layer of this issue is clearly that strategic competitors are taking advantage of this situation. So what they are doing is basically, and this is what has been said in the previous presentations over the morning, to transform what up to now has been considered as strategic advantages of our democratic systems into vulnerabilities, because it's very open, because we are very vulnerable to money, and our system of information is completely open, and it's basically based on the idea of free flow of information, of ideas, thinking that, oh, this is very good, yeah, to free flow of information, so people can have different views, access to many different information. This is good in terms of society. Yes, in theory, yes, but the problem is, like, it seems that it's not being the case right now. Because, and I will conclude with this idea, we talk much about these hybrid threats, hybrid warfare, gray zones, and there is a lot of academic, scholar discussion about this is the right term or not, and it's good. We need to have these discussions, and it's very good to be precise and to have a clear characterization of the problems. To me, but the point is, if we want to tackle and to do something, the point here is that, or the essence of this thing is that anything can be weaponized. This is the essence of what we are facing now. Yeah? And information is not an exception. And information is at the center of our lives nowadays. We all have these smartphones, and we all have this all information here and now also biometrics, yeah, with facial recognition and all these kind of things. And why I think the worst is yet to come. Up to now, and I finish, we have been facing basically, let's say, handcraft disinformation, info operations, yeah? Tweets, memes, yeah, things that were sophisticated, but imagine now with this artificial intelligence and these deep fake videos. Imagine, I can imagine dozens of cases, yeah, or examples of things that could be, I mean, that could trigger huge problems. And imagine that we have a deep, one of these fake videos, yeah, but looks completely real. Our technology cannot detect immediately that it's fake. And it's distributed massively by accounts on Twitter that look real, so everyone is thinking that, oh, this is real, blah, blah, blah. And this is not only about this particular moment's electoral process or the day of the election. Think also in terms of the accumulative effect, yeah? Imagine this in 10, 20 years' time, this accumulation. Then it will be very, I mean, this has a huge potential for undermining the integrity of our systems. And then, so that's the challenge that we have ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicolás. I think it's very important that you several times mentioned the protection of the integrity of our democratical systems, because it's always important to remember two things, not the enemy that we are fighting against, that's only one to identify, but what we are protecting, what we are defending. And as I always like to say, like how to fight Putin and not to become like Putin or like any other autocratic leader. But now I would like to give floor to Rolf, who is from NATO StratCom. The first time I encountered this institution was the policy paper about robot trolling, which was very impressive. Rolf will mention it a bit, this issue of robot trolling, but mainly he will share his insights on the economy of fake services that fuels both commercial and political information manipulation. So, Rolf, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you to the organisers for inviting me back. It's great to be in Vilnius. My title for you today is Bots, Trolls and the Black Market for Social Media Manipulation. I just want to quickly unpack that so we're all on the same page. Social media platforms, the important thing to bear... With social media platforms, the important thing to bear in mind is that these are user-generated spaces. They're owned by big corporations, but it's people who post content to them. If we think about social media manipulation, we're talking about posts from accounts that are inauthentic. And in terms of bots, these are robotic accounts, fully automated accounts being run by computer programs posing as people, whereas trolls are fake accounts run by humans behind keyboards posing as other people. And this draws together findings from a couple of reports we've published, which you can find on our website, Robo-Trolling and the Black Market for Social Media Manipulation. So if this has a video of what we're talking about, if it will play. So our hero, he's in Moscow. He's taken a photo which he's posting to Instagram. And then he goes down into the Moscow metro station, and what does he find? He finds a vending machine where he can find his user account, the photo he's just posted, and then purchase interactions to improve to improve its visibility online. So here he's purchased likes from what ends up being Brazilian guys. So these guys, they're robotic accounts. They're fully automated accounts run by a computer program, which in this case is hooked up to a vending machine in the real world in the Moscow metro. And this matters from sort of policy perspective, not because of these Brazilian guys boosting this journalist's post, but because in general, fake accounts, they represent fake citizens that give fake feedback, which can skew public conversations in all sorts of undesirable directions. In the robo-trolling report, we take a quantitative approach and try to measure how big this problem is. It's become a bit less over time, but we still see that in Russian language spaces. About 1 in 3 users talking about NATO in the Baltic states and Poland are automated users. They're fully automated, run by computer programs. That's not mentioning the trolls. It's a bit better on the English spaces. And in a unique first, we've also looked at VK, which is a Russian social media platform, and the numbers are comparable. Now, this picks up a point that Frederik raised in his presentation, that these are dual-use or multi-use technologies, same as with behavioral ads. They're designed for a commercial purpose, they become used for a political purpose. Here you've got the people who are selling fake online services rely on exactly the same services as if you're selling political manipulation. This goes to the root of where the social media companies are going wrong in their approach to this space. They try to treat political content as if it's a separate phenomenon. You will hear Facebook talk about tackling information operations on their platform, for instance. But state actors who run information operations, they rely on the exact same services as commercial actors. So you cannot deal with this issue of political interference and misuse of the technology without going to the root of the services that allow this in the first place. Okay, this has gone completely crazy. So here's an example of a video that we posted after an event that we ran. It had about 150 views, and we wanted to see, can we use these technologies to artificially boost this as kind of a case study of what is possible? And actually, yes, that's very easy. You just search for purchase YouTube views, and you get ads from companies who are selling different services, in this case, manipulating YouTube. And just take a second to think of how perverse that is, given how Google also own YouTube. So they're selling one service that defrauds customers of a different service, because YouTube also makes money by selling ads. In this case, to a computer program that will watch a video 1,000 times. It's pretty cheap. We bought about 2,000 views, a number of likes, some customized comments, etc. And it was about $16. And this is an expensive rate. If you go to if you bargain around, if you shop around, you'll get a much better deal than this. pretty quickly the views started trickling in, the likes came almost immediately. Microphone. And this is what the comments look like. They're kind of obviously automatically generated. They're like, worth an Oscar, lovely, adorable, this, kind of nonsense comments. But the point of this is it also creates what you might call sort of meta manipulation, where real people begin interacting with this content as a result of us having poked YouTube's algorithms. So once the fake views, the fake comments came in, we started getting some real comments from real people. We started getting more views for this video because YouTube was now beginning to recommend it to viewers of other content. So even though the stuff we bought was just fake and it just manipulated the numbers, it has an effect later on. And in the end, we got a lot of people coming to our content through Gangnam Style. They were automatically suggested this as their next video. This is from an event we did in the Senate in March of this year, together with Chuck Grassley's office, the senator. And we asked, could we, just as an example, manipulate your online presence? And he said, no problems. We found a picture that he posted at Christmas when he was cleaning his house. This is his vacuum cleaner. And it received a fair amount of interactions. And we thought, can we manipulate this? Because US senator, social media companies, they're policing this space against Russian manipulation, right? So it should be quite hard to manipulate. Well, nothing of the sort. This is what it looks like. So we wrote some custom comments in a text document. We uploaded it to a Russian source. We chose a Russian one, a Russian manipulation seller, just to make the point that you can. And then you can see on the right-hand side those same comments from the text document being posted by different users, fake citizens giving fake feedback to a senator about his vacuum cleaner on the right-hand side. You'll also see that the likes came in no problem. This is what the interface looks like. And again, manipulating his Facebook and Instagram presence was a pretty cheap thing to do. So we reported these comments to Facebook and Instagram. We reported the fake accounts that had been used by the commercial reseller, and basically nothing happened, right? At Instagram, maybe 70% of the content got taken down after about a week. Facebook, nothing happened at all, even after we reported these accounts as fake and as selling spam. On a senator's webpage. And, okay, we were talking about his Hoover, no big deal, but you can see how exactly this would be used for some sort of political feedback, right? So we've published this report about the black market of social media manipulation, and the first finding really is that this isn't a black market at all. Like we already saw, you just Google it and you find the results immediately. There's no need to go down into the dark web or anything like we first imagined. But one of the interesting things about this marketplace is that the underlying infrastructure is really extensive. There's resellers of these manipulation services like we illustrated from every country in the world, including many in the European Union. There's a German company that's turning over almost €1 million a year selling these services. They file their tax returns. It's all very open and above board. And it relies on, am I in trouble? It relies on a series of underlying services. You need fake SIM cards, you need proxy services, you need VPNs, etc. And all of this underlying infrastructure is bundled up and sold as parts of different packages. I think we've covered this. One of the fun things once you start digging is you find this underlying infrastructure, a lot of it is Russian language. Which is not really surprising, that there's a lot of talented Russian programmers who sell various spammy services, and this is just branching into a different area. This is what it actually looks like underneath. So it's a piece of computer software. There's a list of, at the bottom, a list of partner services from which you can buy the fake accounts that you operate through the software. You can buy the VPN services required. You can buy the CAPTCHA entry. Are you familiar with the idea of CAPTCHA? So this is when Google asks, are you a robot? And you have to enter a piece of text or decipher a picture. You can outsource that to people behind a computer in India, get the response back, and feed it into your computer program, all automatically through this software. So, in terms of policies, what do we actually do about this? Sometimes people talk about rights of speech, freedom of speech. It should not apply to robots. We can talk about what types of accounts are being used to run these fake services, and all of these accounts go against the terms of service of the social media platforms. So we don't need to get bogged down in questions of who can say what online. All we need is for the social media platforms to get rid of the fake accounts. Another takeaway is to think of disinformation as spam. And there's a problem with incentives in the online marketplace, in the social media space in particular. If we think about email, Gmail won a lot of the competition between email providers by providing the best spam filters. When I first got my email in the mid-90s, it was full of junk and hardly any authentic email was coming through. Today I never get any spam at all because the filter is so good. There is no comparable incentive for social media companies to get rid of the fake content. In fact, there are disincentives, right? If we think about what determines the stock price of a social media company, it's the number of active users within a platform. And bots and trolls, they're really super active users. So whenever Facebook and Twitter and the other companies delete millions of accounts, they know that this hurts their stock price. And they're doing it primarily to fight PR problems regarding Russian bots. There is no underlying incentive to change the ability to manipulate the platform. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rolf. And last but not least, I would like to invite Natalija to share her insights about the informational campaigns. I actually very liked your quotation that you chose to represent yourself for this event on Facebook. And it states that the modern day informational manipulation campaigns rely on the digital tools widely used by the industry. In fact, the tools and systems behind the online informational manipulation are no different from these employed to convince us to buy a fridge or a pair of new shoes. And actually, yeah, that can be funny, but it just reminded me a new book of Peter Pomerantsev, where it tells a story how in Philippines a guy used to sell his services for the advertisers in his pages on Facebook, romantic ones, or about what's going on in the city. And then one day he decided that he wants to sell his services for a politician. And now we have Rodrigo Duterte there. So.
Okay, hi, everyone. Thank you very much for the introduction, Donatas. And I listened carefully to the presentations of the speakers at this panel. And I guess what I would like to essentially supplement what has been said before and just put a few more accents on the information manipulation. Specifically, I would like to focus on how personal data is used in the information manipulation strategies by different actors, especially during significant democratic events, such as elections or referenda, and what data protection law, which is essentially my everyday bread and butter, can and, more importantly, can't help us do about it. So, first of all, when we talk about interference through disinformation with the democratic processes, I think it's very important. However, I would like to draw your attention to other practices that were discussed here right now, which do not really fall within even the broadest definition of disinformation, which typically is promotion of false or misleading information, right? So these practices do not promote necessarily information that can be objectively considered as false or misleading. Sometimes it's just value judgments not susceptible to proof. Sometimes it's just opinions. However, just because of the nature of these actions, they are aimed not at convincing us about something, but rather to dividing our society. And such practices were already covered, and by such practices I mean highly targeted political advertising, divisive political advertising that was already covered by the speakers before me. And altogether, the common denominator really of these practices is manipulation of people's personal data to promote a message which is favorable to the actor. So altogether, I would like to call these practices informational manipulation. And with that in mind, I thought of looking into who are the actors behind this informational manipulation. So a lot has been covered here today, right? We talked about Russia, we talked about China, we're going to talk about China, we talked about the political parties. Who else is there? We talked about social platforms. So conceptually, I call it a data supply and data demand ecosystem, where on the one hand, you have data demand from either national actors or foreign actors. And by foreign actors, we shouldn't focus just on the states. Let's think about the conservative movements. For example, during the Irish abortion referendum, the ones who were buying a lot of ads were actually the US ultra-conservative movement trying to influence the national vote. And on the supply side, we have the digital platforms, so the big four, but also not them. Let's think about the niche platforms such as 4chan and 8chan and country-specific platforms such as Contacte and Reddit, as well as the intermediaries being advertising industry, data brokery, and data analytics, one of the most infamous currently being Cambridge Analytica. And when you think about it, what is interesting is these actors are sort of very, very different, but their interests to some extent are aligned. All of them are interested in capturing the scarce resource in our society being the attention of the people online, although for different purposes. So actors are promoting their message, whereas the platforms also want to keep the same attention in order to sell more ads, right? So the revenue is growing, the message is being promoted, and everyone is happy. Everyone is really in the same boat. And right now, I would like to just, to give a more facts perhaps here, to give one case which shows the interaction between these actors. And this is pretty much one of my favorite cases so far of targeting, which is a real thing. I call it Emma's Diaries case, which has recently been decided by the Information Commissioner's Office in the United Kingdom. So here we have three suspects, three actors. First of all, we have a website which is called Emma's Diary. And the website is a one for, informational website for mothers expecting children. So it's about, baby clothes and mothers and prenatal care, postnatal care, all that stuff. Then we have Experian, which is a credit reference agency, which essentially makes a living out of buying, selling personal data. And the last but not least, we have the UK Labour Party, which I don't think needs more explanation. So what happened here is that at some point, Emma's Diary sold that many files of personal data to Experian. These files included information about those moms browsing the website and checking stuff for their babies. So their browsing behavior, if they entered information about what stage they are of pregnancy at, their stage of pregnancy, whether they have kids, where they're based, and so on and so forth. All these files were sold to Experian. Then Experian sold. Money exchanged hands. Then Experian profiled the mothers and put them in different categories. One of the categories being where exactly these mothers, users of the website, lived. Money exchanged hands again. What the Labour Party then did, they took the files, they sort of filtered it by location, and they crafted mails to the mothers living in the areas of the UK with the marginal seats, and that is happening before the 2017 UK general elections. So they crafted the messages for the mothers living in the areas with marginal seats, and the message was something around the fact that the Labour Party is going to protect children's centres, which were up to closure. So they were trying to convince the mothers that the Labour Party is standing behind children. And they sent all these messages to them. So not to all the mothers, not to all the users of the website, not to the whole constituency of the Labour Party, but to the very specific and targeted group. So what happened? The UK Data Protection Authority, Information Commissioner's Office, started investigation as a part of the big investigation they undertook into the political advertising. And they found that Emma's Diaries violated a set of data protection rules under the previous UK data protection regime. Specifically, no one informed the mothers where their data is going, it was not unfair towards them, and it was quite manipulative. What you can see here is the fine that was imposed on the Emma's Diary. There is a separate investigation going into the data brokers, such as Experian, and a separate investigation ongoing into the political parties. And I guess the point here that I was trying to make is that there is a potential in something that perhaps this audience didn't regard as a usual suspect in the data protection law to address at least some parts of the informational manipulation. How and why? So first of all, in the EU, we have the General Data Protection Regulation, which is essentially a law outlining how personal data should be collected, used, processed, so on and so forth. It imposes strict rules and even bigger fines, such as up to 20 million of global annual turnover, so on and so forth. What is interesting about this law is, not unlike in other jurisdictions, it applies to pretty much everyone. So it applies not only to the companies, but also to political parties, to the governmental institutions, to political movements, formal, informal. And even more than that, I guess one of the most controversial aspects of the law, but can be very useful for the purposes of the discussions today, is that it applies not only to those who are established in the European Union, but also to those established outside the European Union, who provide goods and services to the people in the Union or monitor their behavior. So think, for example, Kontakte, right? Which is a Russian platform, which is recognizably a vehicle for some of the disinformation campaigns. And to my, so obviously they would fall within the scope of the law and the GDPR would reach them. So at least in theory, there could be enforcement against Kontakte. But what it was interesting for me, a quick search rendered that they sort of acknowledge that. They are saying on their website that they are falling within the GDPR jurisdiction. I was honestly very surprised about that, but at least this is not a controversial topic. And I think we could, if we spend more time here, build a case of GDPR enforcement against the foreign actors, but I think it would merit a separate event, so I'm just going to go ahead with that. At the same time, the reach of the data protection law is limited. And if you remember the Emma's Diary case, which I just outlined for you right now, we can sort of pick apart three phases there. So first phase was data collection, right? When Emma's Diary and Experian collected the data about the mothers. Then there was profiling, undertaken by Experian to divide mothers into the categories. And the last stage was targeting, where the message was sent to them. And these are three very typical stages for the majority of targeted campaigns. And if you think about the data protection law, it provides pretty strict protection or strict rules for data collection, for profiling. But when it comes to targeting and the content of the message, here is the reach of the data protection law. It ends there. So essentially, from the standpoint of the GDPR, it doesn't really matter of what Labour Party was promoting. Whether child centers actually existed or not, they could have been completely made up. Whether that was disinformation, whether it was real information, it doesn't matter from the standpoint of the data protection law because it's content neutral. And clearly, we might say, well, you know, it's a political speech, freedom of expression, broad boundaries, broad margin of appreciation. But on the other hand, we could also debate, and here I put a quote by the distinguished scholars in the field, of whether in our data-driven world, maybe additional principles, additional legal safeguards are needed to extend legal protection and perhaps to capture these unfair political practices. Because if you were to try promoting selling a fridge and lying about the size of the fridge, the color of the fridge, the qualities of the fridge, your message would be covered by the consumer law. So what you were doing would be unlawful. If you're doing that in the political context, that is sort of, this is the green zone we're talking about here. Actually, that would be pretty lawful. So should there be actually a regulation of any type against this type of activity? And last point that I wanted to make is even in that limited scope of the data protection law, there are few things that are necessary for it to work. And I think the law is as good as its enforcement. And the main power behind the enforcement of the data protection law are data protection authorities who are supposed to be independent and well-resourced. There is one in each of the EU member states. But it would be difficult to talk about the independence of the regulators in the regimes or in the countries where the health of the rule of law in the EU is questionable, because the checks and balances are really not fully in place. So that, in my opinion, creates a risk of the far-reaching data protection law being enforced selectively, and it is particularly problematic if the ruling majority is actually the one engaged in the informational manipulation campaigns. So my takeaway from all this would be quite reminiscent of the first panel, when we said that we firstly have to do our homework, and our homework is also to strengthen the health of the rule of law in the EU as a whole. And if you would be interested to read more, this is the study I co-authored with some of the experts for the European Parliament Libe Committee, which talks more about the manipulation and the rule of law. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I look at the schedule and I see the time running really fast, so maybe you have some urgent questions and would like to join our discussion, so I look at the audience. Okay. I wonder, what kind of changes do you see in the environment of the social networks? So to say, for example, before the last European Parliament elections, there was the document signed, the European Commission together with the Facebook, Google and Twitter signed the Code of Practice on Disinformation, and it was expected to increase this transparency of the processes to help for the coming European Parliament election. And afterwards we saw some announcements that Twitter closed that many accounts and Facebook took some action. But maybe Rolf, you would begin, was it adequate, and what kind of trends do you see in robot trolling?
Was it adequate? No, it was not adequate. What they reported was basically, we closed down X million accounts during this period, which is great. But what they're talking about is closing down accounts at the point of creation. What they're not really saying is how many were created that went on to actually operate on the platform. So let's imagine we wanted to create a robot army of 10,000 accounts. We have a computer program that does that for us, let's say. And it takes 1 million attempts before we reach 10,000 functional accounts. Then we have a situation where 1 million accounts have been closed down, and we still have 10,000 fake accounts at the end of it, right? So they've still, if we think in terms of a bank robbery, there were all these failed attempts, but the bank was still robbed in the end. So they're kind of reporting slightly the wrong thing. I think effective regulation looks more like what you get in terms of the financial system, where there is the ability for independent people from outside to go in and look at anonymized data, to look at to look at transaction flows, etc. We need something a bit like that within the social media space.
I would like to point out one issue that didn't come up in our talk so much yet, that it seems at first glance that there's a quite easy solution, namely making platforms responsible for all the mess that happens. So making Google responsible for those ads, etc. And I'm clearly not a US-style free speech extremist. However, but we also must realize that social media will probably overblock and overreact if we say take out quickly all disinformation in political discussions. Because it could even lead to the situation that Facebook thinks, you know what, to keep out of this mess, we will not allow any politics anymore on the platform. That may even make them more money. They would be free from any criticism from regulators, or at least from some type of criticism. And that is probably also not what we want, because social media has empowered many people to express themselves. And that is partly what makes it so hard to, because there isn't an easy solution. We need some type of, law professor speaking, we need to strike some type of balance because, yeah, there's various fundamental rights involved.
Yeah, I agree. Of course, there has to be a balance. I'm just saying where the balance is at the moment. I didn't include the slides of how obvious some of these fake accounts actually are, how easy it is to detect them. And I'm just a humble data scientist in Riga, pulling out these big clusters of accounts that are so obviously fake and that we've been tracking for many years and nothing ever seems to happen to them. Maybe 1 or 2 accounts get taken down if they get reported individually, but there is no attempt at going after the cluster. So if you have 1,000 accounts that are obviously fake and doing the same thing, you have to report all those 1,000 accounts individually for that to be effective, which is kind of a ridiculous situation. So what I'm saying is you go after the types of activity that are not allowed, posting through computer programs, for instance, through fake accounts, rather than what exactly are they saying through those fake accounts. I think that gets you maybe 80–90% of the way, and then you've got freedom of speech issues which become a really difficult grey zone for sure. But you shouldn't be in a situation where you can have physical infrastructure that relies on the provision of these manipulation services and are obviously financially successful.
Oh. Thank you very much. Eitvydas Birūnas, Lithuania Foreign Ministry. I was very much fascinated of your previous, the very last discussion on the balance of control, non-control. But my question is more, if you would, some of you at least, would try to look to the future. Because what we are discussing here, even not least during this session, is reflecting and trying to reflect current reality, what's happening and how we should react and so on. But my question is, what is the future ahead of us? Big data, artificial intelligence, deep fake, and so on. And this is what the bigger question, what we should be prepared for the future. What are these challenges ahead of us? More or less understand your points, what we should do now, but what is ahead of us? Thank you. More futuristic question, but I think important.
Well, I'm hungry and I want lunch. Perhaps that makes me pessimistic, but it could easily imagine a future where deep fakes, like successful videos where with other people's faces put in, that leads to a situation that in 5 or 10 years we basically cannot believe any video anymore that we encounter online or even on television. I hope that some type of solution comes up, but that is a possible scenario. There is an idea, but I'm only throwing it out there because I'm not sure what I think of it yet. You could perhaps imagine a situation in which, let's say, some trusted parties, New York Times, BBC, whatever, do some type of digital fingerprinting on what they publish. And apparently computer scientists tell me that that would be harder to fake. That can be done in a way with digital signatures, etc. That it is harder to fake, so that you don't, as a consumer, you don't check like how real does this look, because within a few years everything will look, also fake stuff will look super real. But you can check, does this come from a trusted source? But I'm not sure whether that's the way to go, because there's also real advantages in enabling citizen journalism and blogging, etc. So it would put more power towards all the institutions. And I'm an avid newspaper reader, but in some countries it's extremely useful that there's also independent bloggers, etc. No, mostly pessimism from now at this stage.
I'd agree, the future is pretty bleak. I'm not so worried about deepfakes, because that's quite a labor-intensive, high-investment sort of intervention. You know, you've had photo manipulation for many, many decades, but it's quite a costly form of doing this. I think, but I think also in the future. But this is not the future. This is now, right? You can Google for a website called something like "This face does not exist," something like that, and every time you reload the page, it will show you a new, randomly generated photo, which is usually very hard to tell the difference. I've seen presentations where you put one authentic photo next to an inauthentic photo, and you ask the audience, and it's sort of 40% of the audience can't guess the right one. So this is happening right now, and also with the creation of text. There's been some incredibly scary open source software, meaning anybody can just generate unique and plausible and coherent sentences. So when we're even whole news articles, poems, etc. This is terrifying, because when I detect huge networks of bots, often it's a lot of accounts saying the same thing at the same time. But when you've got unique voices saying variations on a theme, and they all are somehow plausibly human, this is a worry, and this is happening now.
Yeah.
Just a bit of optimism here. With respect to at least the deepfakes videos, there is quite some, I think it will get cheaper actually in the future to produce them because of the possibilities within the open source community. But at the same time, there are right now very good countermeasures which are also going to be more available in the future. And one of them is being QU project in video, which they're doing great campaigns. And essentially this software, I think, is the best right now in Europe at detecting the deepfakes. I think InVid or InVideo, something like that. I think the question for me about the future is, we can imagine also types of scenarios, right? So right now we're talking a lot about text and informational manipulation through text and images. We should also think about the voice-activated search, about the augmented reality, or other type of realities, and so on and so forth. My question is, and my concern is that what I'm seeing is the trend that this is more and more concentrated in the hands of the few. So even though it seems like dispersed efforts, eventually we are still having the same few big companies behind all that technology. And these companies are accumulating not only commercial power that we're talking so much about, but something that I would call a civic power. So civic power to essentially either, make people go vote or make people stay at home and not to vote, to the extent of who are they going to vote for. So that is my concern for the future.
Thank you, Natalija. So we have 2 pessimists and 1 optimist. So the result is 2-1. And Nicolás, which side will you join with your predictions for the future?
I'm sorry, but I'm even very pessimistic in the short term. So I'm so sorry for that. But I appreciate optimism, because I think it's much more intelligent. And yeah, so it's always easier to be pessimistic. But in the short term, yeah, definitely I'm pessimistic, because I really think that actually we are focusing on what is in the public open domain, but what happens with WhatsApp and on other kind of environments in which in principle is private. And I don't know, everyone has a family, relatives. I have a big family in Spain, and it's like it's quite useful in terms of research, but it's quite concerning in terms of the kind of bullshit that sometimes my relatives are sharing, and so. So no, sorry, I'm not optimistic, but I hope next year I will be, I don't know.
So the final result after 3 added minutes, like in a football pitch, you know, is 3-1. The pessimists won, but hopefully during the lunch break, when we can meet unofficially, informally, so we can find some better solutions and come back more optimistic. And I would like to say thank you to Rolf, Natalija, Frederik, and Nicolás for sharing their insights about today, about the future, and the challenges that are awaiting us. Thanks for everyone that was here present. And anyway, we have to work together to preserve our democracies. So have a good lunch. And the lunch, it's at the same place where we had coffee breaks. And we have 1 hour for that. So please be back at 2:30 here for the third consultation, which will deal with China.